Introducing our challenging contenders stepping into the ring at a relatively minuscule confirmed age range of 2 to 3,000 years at best. We have the modern proselyte religions originating largely from the Middle Eastern regions and professing the divine authority of any one of a handful of religious scriptures, each of which generally being a variation of one another, uh, edited and qualified to suit the interests and approval of whatever ruling faction happens to be making use of them at the time. For the most part, these ancient texts are really just a veritable compendium of political doctrines that are presented as though they are accurate historical accounts, which, for the most part, these parables are accurate historical accounts insofar as they have been collected and appropriated from various times and places before the actual creation of these fictitious works, these mythologies. And the the most popular, trendy version of this religion at the time, at the moment, would be biblical scriptures, Christianity, and other cult factions that have stemmed from Christianity as its origin, so to speak. But as I've said, these they for a lot of these are going to be professing a messianic figure in the form of Jesus Christ or the Prophet Muhammad in some of these versions going into the Quran, which we'll get to that in a minute. But professing Jesus as Jesus Christ or Jesus of Nazareth as a messianic figure that was born of a virgin birth and just walks on water and turns water into wine and multiplies fish in his hands and is just capable of doing all manner of impossible feats, at least feats that are to be considered impossible given our current understanding. But personally, I believe that it would be my understanding that sure, it's possible to perform any number of these miracles, and that the actual messianic figures may very well have done this. However, the fact of the matter is that there are various versions of this story of Jesus, just with different names. Not Jesus, but going back to Kemet, Egypt, into Mesopotamia, Samaria, just way back into cultures that we don't even remember anymore, that no longer exist for the most part, but have become kind of legends in our perception. But even the actual Jesus figure, which is a collection of characteristics from different characters and different stories throughout time that all played out the same story, essentially. The most definitive version of this story being the Hindu Rig Vedas, which I personally think is a masterful work and I love it. It's just for from my perspective, that tells an actual historical account of what may have happened in regards to a war in the heavens and whatnot, which I've gone over that before, and I don't really have space for it here, but um, we have this Bible that originated in the Middle Eastern regions, and it prophesied the coming of this messianic figure, and then of course he showed up and made his way through the world performing miracles, collecting followers, and essentially building what from our modern perspective consideration would essentially amount to a cult following a cult. That's precisely what was happening there. It's no different than any other cult that's developed nowadays, except that we put a stop to it now before it can get out of hand and become something that starts to take over the world. So we didn't do that this time, and we actually went so far as to, from what we're told, murder this figure, martyr him in order to seal the deal and make absolutely certain that his legend lives on. Now, whether or not this figure actually existed is up for debate, but the these stories of this figure are presentable in many different cultures throughout history. So it is to be presumed that there in fact was a messianic figure, perhaps several different messianic figures, or perhaps it's just, um, you know, that one such of these miraculous situations may have transpired, for one person here, for another person there, and then eventually they just were all collected into this single story and presented as Jesus. Whatever the case may be, uh, Jesus himself, as a microcosm of that factor, in fact, presented his teachings in the form of parables, which were, for the most part, a collection of a paradigm of associations, which, he would give teachings that were originating in different sects of what we call spiritualities or religions, philosophical methodologies, as I stated in the last video. Um, like, for example, Buddhism with the concept of reincarnation and karma. These are ideas that Jesus presented through parables in the form of the current religion that was existing for the Roman culture. As from the perspective of an onlooker in this day and age, it would appear that if Jesus was actually there, we're gonna go ahead and presume that Jesus was a real person now. Jesus showed up and presented teachings that were, for all intents and purposes, radical teaching. This was an activist. This was an extremist who was teaching radical ideas that people had not considered before, and he was utilizing the current trendy tradition and religion as a functioning parable to teach through that lens so that people around him would understand it. But basically what he taught was the same fucking things as the older traditions, our traditions, the traditions of spotters. And, he taught that we were all part of a single entity, that God and I am one, and that you are all the same as me, that we are all together, that we are all capable of performing these tasks. And in fact, I should like to think was promoting that you go ahead and give it a shot. Get up and try to do something. You can be a messiah too. Let's have some fun here. If we all start kicking ass, maybe we'll get something done. I should like to think that was what was on Jesus's mind when he was telling people, you can do what I have done. Maybe you probably should, is what I'd like to think, because I'm going to tend to lean towards the idea that Jesus was a cool guy and knew what the fuck he was talking about, because he's saying a lot of the same shit that I would, so I agree with him. However, at one point, this story changes. Later on, after his death, the story is altered. And first of all, they managed to leave in the part during the story where Jesus on the cross, being crucified, being brutally tortured and murdered for telling people that they have power. He was just fucking destroyed in every possible way. His name was besmirched. Propaganda was spread regarding him. He was destroyed in every possible way, then beaten, tortured, humiliated, and murdered in the most brutal possible way by the ruling factions of the time, because he was telling the poor and the helpless that they indeed have power and can make use of it. So he was taken out because that's slanderous, that's heretical. And even now, the people who worship his teachings are going to say that it's heresy for me to tell you that you have power. For any of us to say that we have the power, that God is with us, that God is in us, we are one with God, that we are all part of this ultimate entity, that's heresy in their mind. And it's blasphemy, and in fact we are going to be punished eternally for even suggesting it. Now, at the same time, we don't even have to suggest it, because as I was saying, later on, changes were made to the story that introduced such ideas as Jesus preaching thought crime, which suggested that if you cat hair, man, that if you so much as even think of perhaps sleeping with an attractive woman, or perform, if you get pissed off at somebody and your thoughts go to hurting them, which are automatic reactions you can't control. These are not things that you decide upon. Your thoughts are going to wander. Things are going to pop up in your mind. despite your wanting or desire, despite your spiritual considerations. Doesn't matter who you are, you're going to have odd thoughts in that manner, and you are also going to be punished eternally by God for it, according to this secondary version of the mythical Jesus. Um, Now, let's see. Yeah, introducing thought crime. These are changes that were made, and another changes that were made, you know, altering covenants that were made. These are political doctrines, these covenants, these ideas of there being commandments and whatnot, that had caused, even by their accounts, would have caused, but they actually describe these accounts of, parents stoning their own children to death, people being fed to lions, people being crucified, people being hung, raped, murdered, all kinds of things because of these rules that were then later changed because apparently God changed his mind, you know. And of course, God is a he, God is the father in this story. Um, he created the world in 6 days and created mankind in a terribly ridiculous manner that doesn't seem to make a whole hell of a lot of sense at all. Um, of course, he used a piece of the original man to create woman, making woman a subjugate species, as it were, that women are to be, ruled over by men, and men are to be given the adoration and obedience. Uh, it and then it speaks of a an afterlife situation wherein you might go to heaven, you might go to hell, depending on apparently what you even think, let alone do, could put you in heaven or hell forever. And it doesn't ultimately it doesn't matter how good a person you are if you do not profess your love for Jesus Christ and worship this image of him on a cross being murdered, which, by the way, we have these 10 commandments, the secondary 10 commandments that were issued when this covenant was altered, that tell us, for example, God professing, "Thou shalt place no image before me, thou shalt worship no false idols aside from me." Very insecure statements suggesting that God is an insecure personality that is very self-aggrandizing and cannot have people, even so much as thinking of doing anything other than like kissing his feet and worshiping the ground he walks on, which, by the way, we also have, in the older texts leading up to the Bible, such as the Quran, where we can become aware of cult influences such as the communion of Isis, Ra, and El, which are Egyptian cultures for the most part, that were cult aspects, three different cults that combined to become Israel and created this pact that eventually became what would amount to Christianity, and brought together their myths of a Messiah to create this story, which, by the way, going back into the Quran, we have Islam, which, for all intents and purposes appears, you know, to be philosophical mannerism, so to speak. It's not so, it's not so damaging for the most part until we get to the into the factors where people worship the concept of a jihad or a holy war and believe that there are enemies to God somehow roaming the world, and that pretty much amounts to anybody outside of their immediate culture who does not worship their book as they do. Anybody else is evil in their mind, and they're justified in murdering them, even going so far as to kill themselves, suicide bombers and whatnot, that they're just not only are they justified doing this, but they will be rewarded in their afterlife, which many theists, as it were, fake theists, fraudulent theists, religious fanatics, cultists, will suggest that if you are an atheist, if you do not believe in an afterlife scenario, then that frees you up, that makes it so that you have no consequences to deal with in the afterlife, and in what case you're pretty much free to run rampant and do as you please, and that's a dangerous concept. And the fact of the matter is that if you do not believe in an afterlife, which obviously is not a good choice to make, because then you just kind of die and vanish. And I mean, I know you're not afraid of that. There's no reason to be, but it's also kind of boring and empty, isn't it? However, it does place more value on your immediate actions in this particular lifetime, that you really need to make good use of this and do good things, and you don't want to waste your time by, say, being put in prison for having committed violent acts. You're more likely to kind of contain yourself if there is no afterlife, because you're not going to get another chance really to make right. And I mean, it's the with given this afterlife scenario and the belief in that you know anything that you decide to interpret from your scriptures, which any person can decide to interpret it any way they please, and so long as they have a preacher or pastor agreeing with them, it's perfectly justified for them to do any fucking thing they want to in the name of their God, which is exceptionally scary. That's a very, very scary scenario, and we've seen what it can accomplish. I mean, I dare any religious person, any Christian, good Christian or Muslim, to give me an example of any single social discrepancy, any political or just generally social or communal difficulty or problem facing humanity, any war, you know, any genocidal acts, any enormous fucking violent problems that have erupted in the world are immediately concerning us, that did not originate with your scriptures. Just one. Just give me one example of a problem we have that did not originate from your teachings. I dare you. You have 1 week to provide it. Now, also, that speaking of the Quran leading up to the creation of the Bible, and then we have the 10 Commandments, which say such things as thou shalt worship no God before me, thou shalt place no image before me, thou shalt worship no false idols, thou shalt worship no graven image. Now, this is a repeated concept over and over again. You would better focus on me. The he God, the Father, will not tolerate anybody looking elsewhere, giving a shit about anything other than his magnificence and just praising him endlessly. How dare you even consider worshiping anything else? But then, of course, what you do with that information is worship the graven image of your Messiah, murdered, your immortal Messiah, dead on the cross, having been tortured to death by your people and in your country, no less. And you just kind of stood by and allowed for this to happen. I know that you considered the Romans to be not your people, but I mean, it was kind of a collaboration between everybody now, wasn't it? We all just went ahead and killed Jesus, apparently, for no other reason than that he was saying something we disagreed with. Mind you, we still use the same religious format that they did. So we still disagree with Jesus. Nobody agrees with Jesus. The things that Jesus taught you, you presently are in contradiction to. You presently do not believe in. You contradict it daily. Every move you make, you decidedly determined to be against Jesus' teachings, refute them, dismiss them, ignore them, yet profess that others must believe in them, or they are going to be tortured eternally by some dictatorial man god that is just terribly insecure and vain, breaks his own commandments, breaks his own 7 deadly sins, commits every one of them in his commandments. By giving his commandments, he commits those sins. Now, as I've said in another video, I'd like to suggest that these commandments were presented, and in fact it says in the Bible, which, to get across my perspective on this, there is actually a working deity concept. There is a living presence in the world, and it will get its message across one way or another. Even in your holy scripture, which is for the most part just a collection of lies made up to control people, to manipulate society. It's a political piece. The Bible is a piece of political propaganda. That's hard set. There's no arguing that. That's exactly what it is. It teaches you such things as what the exchange rate is on children if you decide to get rid of them because your wife, cheated on you. In what case you can go ahead and murder her. It's okay for you to kill people. It's okay for men to rape women, and women are to be blamed for it because women should know better than to be attractive in a man's presence, because it can't be helped that a man gets sexually aroused and will violently attack women in a sexual manner because of that arousal. They should not be blamed for that because they kind of own the women to begin with. So who gives a shit, right? The women are just property. I mean, and then this is the rules that is set with this Bible, which is intended to be a spiritual construct. And for the most part, this this uh this biblical before I go on, I've suggested that these 10 commandments are in fact presented by the living world, by the real God figure, by the essence of us, the me, the I, the identity, the oversoul, or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter. It's just the energy, the source. It doesn't, call it whatever the fuck you want to. It's just, it is what it is. I am that I am. It got its message across in those 10 commandments. It said very specifically in the story, and this has never been changed. They were unable to alter this part for whatever reason. It says, you will know that I have come by these signs. And then it defines itself in 10 fucking strings. It says, this is what I am not. And then if you look back on the Bible and you read the stories of God murdering people and promoting rape and promoting, the murder of children and just all manner of fucking diabolical discrepancies. Mind you, going back again to the Quran with Isis, Ra, and El, these were pharaohs, by the way. Isis was the feminine aspect, but these were Egyptian deities that were considered to be the essence of the pharaohs promoting the idea of reincarnation, and that they were somehow gods that had been reincarnated in human form, making them the pharaohs, which were titled gods and referred to as being gods. Then you have the stories of God murdering people out of jealousy, out of spite, just committing all manner of horrendous acts out of supposedly sinful mannerisms, the motivations that are of a completely contradictory essence. And then we think of that as being God, of course, because it's not obvious enough that this is an imposter. It's not obvious enough that any pharaoh or king or ruling factor would have been called God and would have committed those acts. And then later on, we have Jesus speaking of a different kind of God altogether. We have Jesus speaking of a God that is in us all, and that is, an ever-present force, and that allows for us to be free and have our own, deliberate intentions. And then we kill him for that, declare the Old Testament God to be the God that he was speaking of after he's dead, and then we change the story on what he said and did in order to suit our whomever's interests. This is just, I understand that perhaps this isn't like constructed well enough for you to kind of follow, but any one of the things that I've said should have been a red fucking flag. It's just a big bright alarm bell. But Jesus even introduced an 11th commandment immediately before he was murdered by political religious figures, that thou shalt do unto others as I have done unto you, which later became interpreted as do unto others as you would have done unto you. The golden rule that everybody accepts as being the golden rule, but not any of the religious fanatics even know that that is in fact the 11th commandment, because chances are they haven't read the Bible, really. They just kind of claim to have. And they certainly don't understand a hell of a lot of it if they do read it. Likely because it's not very well written at all. Even after all of the editing we've done, it's still kind of a crappy book. But I think it's of value. It can be of value if you know how to look at it. If you keep those 10 commandments in mind and consider that some of this might be bullshit, and then you take what is actually valuable from it, you can gain insights into life and make use of them, because for the most part, the insights that are provided in the Bible are stolen from our tradition earlier on. So, I mean, but what the Bible does ultimately as a collective narrative is promote the concept of sacrifice. That it is good for you to sacrifice yourself, to forfeit your power, to be obedient, especially if you're a woman. There's an hierarchy of how people should be obedient to other people, should be obedient to other people, who should ultimately be obedient to a monstrous, terrifying God figure that is just exceptionally self-absorbed and changes his mind all the time. Which other questions that the theists, the fake fraudulent cult theists, will ask is, where does the universe come from? To atheists, if you don't believe in God, where does the universe come from? Where does God come from? Because an impulse cannot exist without a point of origin. So tell me where your God came from. Tell me where his God came from. Tell me where everybody came from, and just keep going down the line as far as you can. Keep telling me where everybody comes from, because you really have to do that in order to justify the existence of your God, now don't you? Or you can go ahead and say that God just exists as is, and has always existed, in what case that would probably be the correct answer to where does life come from too, now wouldn't it? Anyways, it promotes the idea of self-sacrifice. It promotes the idea of being totally pacifistic and allowing ruling factors to just step on you, even crucify you if they want to. Don't fight back. Do not raise an argument. Do not fight back. Do not change your mind. Don't think for yourself. Just follow the rules. Sacrifice yourself. Sacrifice your power. Just forfeit everything that matters to you in order to follow the rules that are dictated upon you by some figure that you have no clue whatsoever even ever existed at all. And if it did, it's very obviously a terrible fucking person, which it is a person, obviously, because, intangible forces don't murder civilizations and burn down villages and tell people that it's okay to rape somebody else's wife if you give them a sheep or a lamb or something. It also promotes the idea that, there's something wrong with sexual activity innately, which is the only, like, ultimately innately primal aspect of humanity and any animal, really any existing fucking living entity. Sex is the primary drive, and it's the most enlightening and wondrous experience you can have. It's the best fucking thing there is. Sex and love and romance is the best drug on the market, and it's going to tell you that there's something wrong with it, and that in fact you're going to be eternally burnt in a river of fucking fire or lake of fire for even thinking about sex, apparently. It suggests that, this holy book is so much more important than anybody, that it'd rather a person be slain than lay this book on the filthy ground, which now it's suggesting that nature is disgusting, that God's creation is somehow filthy and disgusting, and that it should not, you should not besmirch this man-made Bible by placing it on the disgusting natural ground. And I mean, it the whole thing is, it's justifying any action so long as it's serving man. The predicate sentiment here is going to be sacrifice unto man. Man, the male entity, is the ruling factor, and that everybody should be subdued. All women should be subdued. All animals should be subdued. Nature should be subdued by man, who is to serve the concept of this fictitious God that, may or may not believe this or that given the time frame and the circumstances. God apparently is an objective principle, moral factor upon humanity, but at the same time is kind of a context sensitive entity. It may or may not believe something depending on the circumstances, and it might change its mind anyway. everything about it is, of course, we can present the general time mechanics, understanding that time is moving in reverse. We're observing things backward. It that's the perfect example of that is with the afterlife suggestion with atheism, that it's suggested somehow that having no afterlife scenario, having no afterlife consequences frees you up to do any. It's exactly the opposite. It doesn't free you up to do anything. It makes it very much important that you do the right thing now. Whereas Christians can pretty much go around and do whatever they want to, just murder anybody. And so long as they check in with their priest and admit that they did it, they're forgiven and they get to go to heaven afterwards. Muslims, on the other hand, they actually get rewarded for murdering people, especially if they kill themselves in the process, and they get rewarded with sexual devices, no less, namely a bunch of virgins or some such shit that's going to be provided by God in heaven, because God has a fresh stock of sexy virgins to provide to any person that's willing to murder his creations. Wake up, people. Anyways, there are two concepts. Oh, something I missed. Original sin. Also, that's going to be another predicate sentiment to this whole thing, is the suggestion that no matter who you are, when you're born, you're already in trouble. No matter what you do throughout life, some dude way back when sinned by accepting an apple from his girlfriend, who was his slave, essentially. So, I mean, really, her giving him the apple should have been up to him now, shouldn't it? It means she shouldn't have even been allowed to look at that apple unless he told her to, according to what we know. But, I mean, she shouldn't even really have enough thought in her head to observe the apple in the first place, unless Adam had directed her to. But, she offered him the apple. He was stupid enough to eat it because there's something wrong with that apple, which it wasn't an apple. It was actually what we call a doom fruit, which is a similar fruit that I don't think tastes very good at all. But according to what we know, I mean, obviously there probably was never any fruit at all. This is a metaphorical account. We'll have to get into that in another video because I've already gone way over the limit, and I doubt anybody's going to watch this, so I'm going to have to break it up again. But anyways, this concept that because somebody did something that really doesn't make any sense whatsoever, I mean, there's no sensible impression that you can make of this story. There's a tree of knowledge, and if you eat from it, you'll know the difference between good and evil, and for whatever reason, that makes you just fucking screwed forever, and all of your progeny, and from the very straight out the gate, my immaculate creation, I'm going to denounce and suggest is evil and sinful and wrong because of the pseudo mistake of the single first person, and now all of his progeny is damned and has to work their ass off to receive potential salvation or redemption in the eyes of this God figure. It's holy shit, man. It's just like I'm hoping some of you can at least see our point of view on this, our perspective, when we say that it's truly unbelievable that you can buy into this, because it's the most ridiculous fucking thing that's ever been presented. It's like, it's almost as though the people that made this did it specifically as a joke, so that they can laugh at how many people are going to be stupid enough to buy it and live by it. Like, you have other options that actually make sense. You have many other options that make perfect sense and are workable. But you're going to choose this, the only one that's entirely wrong in every possible way. Like, it's going forfeit your conscience to believe in this. You have to, because the fact of the matter is that if you start thinking for yourself, any given one of these considerations is going to come across to you as being immediately detrimental and terrifying. These are all very horrible suggestions to make. Everything about this is all wrong. So that's about as much as I can say about it right now, except for the simple fact that there are only two concepts that make any sensible argument for the Bible and the biblical scriptures. Either A, God is an evolving entity that kept changing its mind because at that time it was very immature. He was very immature and didn't know what he was doing and had to figure it out as he went along. And maybe God's still changing his mind about things because he doesn't know what he's doing and he's figuring it out as he goes along. In what case, the Bible isn't really that great of an authority, is it? Considering that it's been a long time since God changed his mind that many times throughout the course of that story then. So that's A. B. The biblical God is an imposter, is one of the pharaohs or kings or a ruling entity, and it's all bullshit. That it's not really a God, it's just a person. And that Jesus was speaking of the living world, not an imposter pharaoh. Period. And he was murdered for that because we still had, Caesar or whoever happened to be ruling at the time. That's all there is to say about it right now. Also consider this. Perhaps Jesus lived. All of these prophecies were gathered from earlier cultures. This is a high potentiality scenario. All of these prophecies were collected, put together, strung together as a prophecy of the coming of this messianic figure, and then this person was brought forth and as a political figure, and these prophecies, the fulfillment of these prophecies had been orchestrated by the ruling factions, which is why Jesus on the cross would have said, "Why have you forsaken me?" Because he certainly didn't expect them to actually murder him. He was their guy. But yes, they sacrificed him to seal the deal on their orchestrated prophecy to make use of this political agenda as pretty much a conspiracy, a big conspiracy to use Jesus as a tool to create an everlasting cult. That's another potentiality. That would make sense. That would make perfect sense given the factors in play. But the other way doesn't. None of it makes any sense whatsoever at all, let alone is it right or justified or in any way good. So that's all I can say about it right now. Thank you for watching. If you did, seriously, 36 minutes, you hung in there. Whether you loved it or hate it, please tell me. Please comment. Please like or dislike. Subscribe if you want. Support. Whatever. If you're supporting your cause against ours, then do it openly. If you're supporting our cause to create unity, bring everybody together, and to kill these ridiculous illusions that are bringing us down, to take care of business and make sure that we're on track and we understand what's really happening in the world, subscribe, get active, comment, do something, get involved. I will back you. My directive, my team will back you. We'll do everything we can to make use of anything you want to present. Get involved with the program here. Love you all. Kila Salai Tevi Uni Siari Namaste.